Hello YouTube! In this video I'm going to talk about skepticism. Now by skepticism I mean global suspension of judgment. The skeptic refrains from holding any beliefs. There are many ways of defining skepticism, but that is how we will be using the term here. So this kind of skepticism is motivated by arguments like Agrippa's trilemma or the problem of the criterion, arguments that target all beliefs, all knowledge, all justification. So skepticism is global suspension of judgment. Now, one of the classic objections to this kind of global skepticism is that it is self-defeating. And in this video, I'm going to examine the self-defeat objection. So, a quick advert. If you like my channel, you can support me on Patreon or with a donation on PayPal. I really appreciate anything people can throw my way. It really helps. I offer private tutoring. Please email if you're interested in that, and feel free to join the Discord. There will be a link in the description for all these things. Okay then, so let's turn to this problem of self-defeat. So, global suspension of judgment. The objection is that this is self-defeating. Now, there are different ways that a position can be self-defeating, so there are different ways of making this kind of argument against the skeptic. So what I first want to do is just consider three different kinds of self-defeat. So one kind of self-defeat is what we could just call incoherence. Basically, a position is incoherent when it is either self-contradictory or it can't be expressed. It's unintelligible for some reason. Now the challenge to skepticism is going to be this. The skeptic suspends judgment about everything. Presumably there's not really a contradiction here, at least there's no obvious contradiction here. We can perhaps imagine beings that suspend judgment about everything. But consider this from the point of view of the skeptic herself. Since she suspends judgment about everything, she must suspend judgment about what it is to suspend judgment. So, by her own lights, she doesn't know what suspension of judgment even involves, right? She doesn't even know what it is to be a skeptic. So, she can't claim to be a skeptic, right? There's a sense in which skepticism cannot even be stated, at least from the skeptic's own point of view. So, it is self-defeating for this reason, right? Like the skeptic herself cannot intelligibly understand what skepticism even is. Okay, a second type of self-defeat objection is that the skeptic may be accused of performative contradiction. Performative contradiction occurs when the content of a statement contradicts the presuppositions of a successful assertion of the statement. A simple example of this would be the statement, "I am dead." Well, clearly, this isn't contradictory or anything. It's possible for me to be dead. I could have been hit by a bus this morning. Like that's something that could have happened. Thankfully, it didn't. But in order for me to say anything at all, I must be alive. So in order for me to say the statement, "I am dead," I must be alive. But that's just what this statement denies. Or consider a statement like, "I am not saying anything." Well, in order to say that statement, I have to say something. So this is a performative contradiction. How does this apply to skepticism? Well, in order to state skepticism, the skeptic must make assertions. She must say things such as, "I suspend judgment about everything," or "I am a skeptic," or whatever. But now, what exactly is it to make an assertion? Well, arguably, you only assert that P if you are claiming that P is true, if you are claiming to believe that P, right? An assertion expresses a belief, or at least it expresses like a purported belief. After all, people can say all kinds of things without asserting those things, right? So take, for instance, the statement, "I robbed a bank yesterday." There's all kinds of situations in which I might utter those words. If I'm telling a joke, or if I'm an actor performing in a play, or if I'm, giving an example in a philosophy video. In none of these cases do I assert that I robbed a bank yesterday. In these contexts, everybody would understand that I'm not confessing to a crime. I don't really believe that I robbed a bank yesterday. The difference between merely uttering the words "I robbed a bank yesterday" and asserting that I robbed a bank yesterday is that when I assert it, I claim it to be true. I claim to believe it. So the skeptic asserts that she is a skeptic. She asserts that she suspends judgment about everything. But in making the assertion, "I suspend judgment about everything," the skeptic is claiming that the proposition "I suspend judgment about everything" is true. And this is just to say that she does not suspend judgment about that proposition. And this is the performative contradiction, because by asserting "I suspend judgment about everything," you are claiming not to suspend judgment about that very proposition. That's contradictory, right? Because to suspend judgment about P is to refrain from claiming that P is either true or false. So it's like the skeptic ends up kind of both not, like she's suspending judgment, but also presupposing that it's true. So you have this contradiction. I mean, perhaps we could say that the skeptic need not be interpreted as asserting that she suspends judgment about everything. But if it's not an assertion, then, what is it? Right? Is it a joke? Is it a story? Is it a piece of performance art? In any of those cases, we're not really dealing anymore with a philosophical debate, right? Like if I say that I robbed a bank yesterday as part of a joke or as part of a fictional story, well, that's not something that anyone's going to dispute, right? There's not going to be any debate about that. Similarly, in this case, if the purported skeptic is merely telling a joke when she says that she suspends judgment about everything, then there's no argument to be had about that. Okay, a third type of self-defeat is methodological self-defeat, and this is probably the most common type of self-defeat argument against skepticism. Methodological self-defeat occurs when a particular method is used to arrive at a conclusion, but the conclusion itself implies that the method is untrustworthy. So the conclusion of the argument removes any reason to believe that conclusion on the basis of the premises of the argument. So why should I suspend judgment about everything, right? Why should I take skepticism seriously? I mean, before thinking about philosophy, before I came into philosophy, I held lots of beliefs, and it seemed that I had good reasons for at least some of my beliefs. And then I encounter this idea of skepticism, and it seems a pretty remarkable view, right? Like, hold no beliefs, suspend judgment about everything. That's quite a striking position. So the natural question is, well, why take that seriously? Well, skeptics will give arguments designed to show that there is no justification for any of our beliefs. Consider, for instance, Agrippa's trilemma. I'm going to just explain this very briefly. It would take a whole video to go into this in detail, but briefly, here's the argument, right? Let's say that I believe that P, and then I'm asked, what is the justification for P? Okay, so I can then cite some further belief, Q, right? I can say I believe that P because of Q. But now again, the question is, well, what is the justification for Q? Now, this line of questioning can continue. And so what we end up with are these inferential chains of justification. I believe that P, and the reason why I believe that P is because of Q. And the reason why I believe that Q is because of R. So we have a chain of justification. Now, for any inferential chain like this, there are three options. First, the chain might terminate in some belief that is not itself supported by any other belief. But then it looks like that's just going to be a mere assumption, right? So if you ask me why I believe that P, and then I cite some chain of justification that terminates in a belief that is unsupported, well, now it looks like P is ultimately just based on, it's just an assumption, right? I mean, it doesn't, there's no support at all there. Second, the chain might go in a circle, right? I believe that P, and then when asked for my reasons for believing that P, I cite Q and R and so on, and then eventually I come back around to P. But then my reasoning is circular, right? That's only going to provide you a reason to believe that P if you already believe that P. Third, the chain might just extend forever. P, Q, R, etc., 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 just going on forever. But But presumably nobody can hold an infinite chain of beliefs, right? You know, if there's this infinite chain, we never actually reach the point where like justification is generated, and in any case, nobody has infinite beliefs in their head. So what we end up with are three options, all of them unpalatable. And from this, the skeptic concludes that, you know, no beliefs are justified, right? There's these three options, neither of these three options confers justification, so no belief is justified. Okay, that's the basic argument. Now, the important thing to notice about this is that it's an argument. The skeptic is forwarding various premises and inferring a conclusion. But if no beliefs are justified, then there are no grounds for accepting any of the premises, nor are there any grounds for accepting that the inference rules that are used are valid. So there's no reason at all for accepting this argument. So the skeptic's own conclusion tells us that the method used to arrive at that conclusion is untrustworthy. And this is going to be a general problem, right? Because if you take any argument for skepticism, it's going to consist of some premises leading to a conclusion. But the skeptic doesn't believe any of those premises, and she doesn't accept any of the inference rules. So, in fact, the skeptic doesn't even believe that her interlocutors believe the premises, or indeed that she has any interlocutors. You know, for all the skeptic knows, her whole world might be a dream. So, in fact, she doesn't believe that her premises mean anything at all. So it looks like the problem is this: a person could only be convinced by these arguments if they hold various beliefs, right? Like, in order for me to be convinced by an argument, I have to believe the premises. But the skeptic's own conclusion is that we should give up all beliefs. So then you're not going to think that these premises lead to that conclusion. So it's self-defeating because the conclusion tells us that the method used to arrive at that conclusion is untrustworthy. So that's the objection. That's the problem of self-defeat. What might we say in response to this? Well, I think broadly speaking, there's going to be two strategies. One general strategy is to deny that skepticism is self-defeating. The other is to just grant that skepticism is self-defeating, but then deny that this is a problem. Okay, so let's start with this idea that skepticism is not really self-defeating. One way to make this, one way to sort of forward this response is to say that the only thing that can really be self-defeating are views or positions. But skepticism isn't a position. Rather, the skeptic simply refrains from taking any position. So it makes no sense to say that it's self-defeating. There's nothing to defeat, so it can't be self-defeating, right? The skeptic suspends judgment about everything. So for any claim, the skeptic is just not sure, right? Like if you present any claim to the skeptic, she's just going to say, well, I'm not sure. So really the skeptic isn't saying anything, which means she can't be saying anything that's self-defeating. Now, I mean, this might seem kind of puzzling, right? Because the skeptic sure seems to hold a position in the sense that we can contrast her state of suspension with the belief states that are held by other people. Moreover, the skeptic gives arguments. If skepticism isn't a position, then what exactly is the conclusion of those arguments? Like, do they just not have any conclusion? Like, what's going on there? So it's maybe worth considering a bit further this idea of lacking a belief, right? When we say the skeptic holds no position, what we mean is that the skeptic lacks belief. Like, that's what it is to suspend judgment, is, you know, when I consider the proposition P, if I suspend judgment about it, then I'm not affirming P and I'm not affirming not P, right? I'm just not affirming either. But we can distinguish different kinds of lack of belief. So take God, right? Like, let's say that I'm just agnostic about God. I don't believe that there is a God, nor do I believe that there isn't a God. I have considered various arguments for and against God's existence, and the result of that is that I just suspend judgment. I just say, yeah, I don't know. So I have no belief about whether God exists. Now compare this to a baby. A baby, similarly, does not believe that there is a God, nor does the baby believe that there isn't a God. The baby also has no belief one way or the other here. But does the baby suspend judgment? Well, I think that would seem like a rather unnatural way of describing what's going on with the baby, because the baby just has no concept of God. The baby has never encountered the ideas or arguments concerning God, so she can't suspend judgment about them. She can't suspend judgment about the proposition there is a God, because she's never even, thought of that proposition. The question of whether to make a judgment or to suspend judgment just doesn't arise for the baby. Even though I suspend judgment about God's existence, arguably it seems like there's some sense in which I am taking a position on God's existence, a position which is informed by reasoning through the arguments about God. Now, the skeptic suspends judgment about everything, but the skeptic isn't a baby. She has encountered these, the beliefs that other people have. She's encountered, she's able to conceptualize things. She's encountered arguments. She's considered them, and as a result, she suspends judgment. So we might say, arguably that's a position, just as much as my agnosticism about God is a position. Now, of course, this isn't how the skeptic will frame things. If you ask the skeptic herself, then she's not going to affirm that she has encountered arguments and considered those arguments, because the skeptic isn't going to affirm anything. But the point is that, looking at it from the third person point of view, I can say, okay, well, yeah, this person who we're calling a skeptic seems to be thinking through various arguments, or at least they seem to be presenting various arguments, so they seem to have encountered these arguments, so it seems like they're in a similar position as I am with respect to the God question. And so we might then say, actually, regardless of what the skeptic herself might say, skepticism is a kind of position, and therefore it can be self-defeating. Okay, another way to approach this idea that skepticism is not self-defeating, or perhaps not even a position, is to say that when talking about skepticism, we can frame skepticism as a kind of challenge. So we don't really even need to suppose that there are any genuine skeptics, right? Here's how this works. The skeptic gives arguments to the effect that there is no justification, say. And these arguments are supposed to appeal to principles that her interlocutors accept. So let's say that I'm not a skeptic. I hold various beliefs, and I take it that I have justification for these beliefs. But then I encounter an argument, like Agrippa's trilemma. This argument is supposed to show that, given principles that I myself accept, I have no justification for my beliefs. So the assumption of Agrippa's trilemma is, I take it that, that you can't get justification by just making an assumption. You can't get justification by reasoning in a circle. You can't get justification from an infinite chain. These are assumptions that I'm making, but then it follows from those assumptions that I have no justification for anything. So Agrippa's trilemma raises a problem for me. It's a reductio of my position as a non-skeptic. Notice that in principle, Agrippa's trilemma doesn't even need to be delivered by another person, right? In principle, it would be possible for pebbles on a beach to be washed up in such a way that they just happen to appear like the English words that state Agrippa's trilemma. Well, as soon as I read those words and I form the argument in my head as a result, I face a skeptical challenge. So the challenge is, it seems that certain principles that I accept are going to lead to global suspension of judgment, or they're going to lead to the conclusion that no beliefs are justified. To respond to this by saying, well, skepticism is self-defeating, that just misses the point, right? That doesn't tell us anything about where this argument goes wrong. It doesn't identify any false premises. It doesn't identify any invalid inference rules. We're still stuck with this challenge. You can say skepticism is self-defeating. Well, but that doesn't resolve the challenge that seems like it's going to lead me to skepticism. If anything, the fact that skepticism is self-defeating just makes the challenge worse, right? Because now I'm going to be led to a position which is self-defeating. So we might frame skepticism as a kind of challenge, right? Skepticism isn't a position, it's more like a kind of set of methods that we can deploy for challenging those people who are not skeptics, those people who or rather, it's a set of methods we can deploy for challenging people who hold beliefs. So if we frame it in this way, then presumably, yes, skepticism is not going to be self-defeating. But it's worth noting that if we frame it in this way, it's also not clear that skepticism can be identified with global suspension of judgment. So we're kind of changing the topic here. So what's going on here is that skepticism is just a sort of critical method. It's like a set of arguments or methods that are used to raise challenges to positions that people hold. And I mean, all that's being claimed is that these arguments pose a challenge. But none of this is particularly controversial. I mean, nobody disputes that people are capable of considering skeptical arguments. Philosophers do this all the time. You don't need to be a skeptic to raise a skeptical challenge. What's controversial is the idea of actually endorsing the conclusions of these arguments. What's controversial is the idea of actually being a skeptic, and by that I mean actually suspending judgment about everything. So this sort of response, by saying, well, we can frame skepticism just as like a set of critical methods or as a set of challenges or something, arguably that just changes the subject here. Like what we're interested in here is, is this, so you don't even have to call it skepticism, right? This state of global suspension of judgment, is that self-defeating? And then just saying that, well, skepticism is a set of critical methods, okay, well, we're changing the subject then. All right then, let's grant that skepticism is self-defeating. So is this a problem for the skeptic? Well, it's first of all worth noting that there's something a little bit paradoxical about the accusation of self-defeat with respect to skepticism. So the skeptic suspends judgment about everything, which means that she also suspends judgment about whether it is a problem for a position to be self-defeating. So the skeptic is not going to take it as an objection that her position is self-defeating. I mean, this is somewhat paradoxical because it's, I think, quite natural to suppose that for some position P to be self-defeating, then P must be unacceptable from the perspective of P itself, right? P must be unacceptable by its own lights, right? That's what it is for it to be self-defeating, right? It's self-defeating because it's unacceptable by its own lights. But by the skeptic's lights, self-defeat is not a problem. So by the skeptic's lights, skepticism is not self-defeating. But then, so if it's the case that from the skeptic's own perspective, skepticism is not self-defeating, it seems like that's just to say that skepticism is not self-defeating, right? So, because the point is that, so the idea is, well, a position is only going to be self-defeating if the position is unacceptable by the position's own perspective. But we've just shown that from the skeptic's own perspective, self-defeat is not a problem. So then it looks like we're saying, well, it's actually not self-defeating. So there might be something a bit paradoxical about this objection, right? About this charge. But putting that aside, I mean, putting aside the somewhat paradoxical nature of this, what we can say is, at the very least, a skeptic doesn't need to be bothered about self-defeat, right? I mean, a skeptic isn't going to be bothered about that. So the skeptic is not going to affirm that self-defeat is a problem. But of course, this is somewhat trivial, right? I mean, obviously, the person who suspends judgment about everything is not going to affirm that self-defeat is a problem, because they're not going to affirm anything. But suppose that I'm not a skeptic. Suppose I think that it is a problem if positions are self-defeating, and I think that skepticism is self-defeating, right? So, well, in that case, from my perspective, there's a serious problem for skepticism. There is an objection to skepticism. There's a reason for me to resist skepticism. Now, merely, to tell me that if I were to become a skeptic, I would no longer see self-defeat as a problem, that's not likely to convince me of anything, right? So, by analogy, suppose I think that it is irrational to form beliefs on the basis of faith. Well, you could tell me that if I were to take a leap of faith and become a Christian, then I would no longer consider it irrational to form beliefs on the basis of faith. Okay, fair enough. But that's not going to give me any reason right now to think that it's perfectly okay to form beliefs on the basis of faith. Like, in fact, there's something kind of trivial about this, right? So, obviously, if I was to adopt a completely different epistemological viewpoint, I would judge different things to be rational or irrational. Like, yeah, of course. So the mere fact that if I were to become a skeptic, I would not consider skepticism self-defeating, or I would not consider self-defeat a problem. You know, that alone does not give me any reason right now to think that self-defeat is not a problem. So I guess the question is, you know, can we say anything more substantive in defense of the skeptic here, in defense of self-defeat? I should say, actually, I have already answered this question. I have a video called In Praise of Self-Refutation, in which I argue that there are good reasons for taking at least some self-defeating theories seriously. I will link that video in the comments, but I'll say a few other things here. So, what's so bad about self-defeat? Well, one thing to keep in mind about skepticism is that a lot of skeptics can be read as challenging our traditional concepts of, you know, truth and reason and so on. So, suppose, for example, that language and propositions and truth, suppose that these tools of language, propositions, of assigning truth and falsehood to things, suppose that those tools are just fundamentally inadequate to capture reality, right? So suppose that a proposition just isn't the right tool for getting at the way the world is. This is an idea that has been taken seriously in many traditions. So in apophatic theology, like the works of Pseudo-Dionysius, it is not possible to state any truths about God. God is beyond affirmation or negation, beyond existence or non-existence. There are no categories of thought that can apply to God. No proposition can be true of God. At best, God can be approached through religious experience. So, you know, the sort of non-linguistic, non-propositional acquaintance with the divine. But you can't actually say anything factually accurate about God. God is just beyond all propositions, beyond all categories. We find similar ideas in Eastern traditions like Taoism. Taoists talk of something called the Tao. The Tao is the order of the universe, the principle underlying reality, and the creative source of all things. But it's also non-conceptual, eternally nameless. The things that can be named or conceptualized are mere manifestations of the Tao, they're not the Tao itself. Now, since the Tao is the source of all properties and characteristics, the Tao itself does not have any properties or characteristics. And of course, it also doesn't have the property of being propertyless. So the Chinese philosopher He Yan describes the Tao as follows, and I quote, "What is dark obtains its blackness from it. What is plain obtains its whiteness from it. The carpenter's square is able to make a square because of it. The compass is able to make a circle because of it. The round and the square obtain their form. But that which gives them their form itself does not have any form. The white and the black obtain their name, but that which gives them their name does not itself have any name." So, I mean, obviously there's a hell of a lot that could be said about both of these sorts of traditions. The point for our purposes is just this. You know, there are lots of traditions which will say that there is like a fundamental inadequacy of language, right? Like there's maybe some sort of mismatch between language and reality, or a way that language distorts reality, or, you know, language just like doesn't hook up to reality. Now, skepticism is at the very least open to this idea. A skeptic is not going to affirm that language is the right tool for understanding reality. Insofar as skepticism is stated as a propositional claim, so, you know, we can, if you ask what skepticism is, we state the proposition. Skepticism is global suspension of judgment. So, if skeptics are open to this idea that, you know, language is just an inadequate tool for understanding reality, and then we state skepticism as a propositional claim, well, it's not at all surprising that this propositional claim might be self-defeating. We should expect it to be self-defeating. Philosophy is conducted using language. We make assertions, we give arguments. The skeptic can do that as well. The skeptic can play that game, but she might be playing that game in order to kind of just point to these non-propositional alternatives. So it is to be expected then that insofar as the skeptic is giving arguments or making assertions, that those arguments and assertions will also be washed away, right? Like so you sort of use the argument as a mere means of pointing to some non-propositional alternative. Well, in that case, it's actually a good thing that the argument would be self-undermining, right? You don't want to end up accepting some new set of propositions. That's not the point, right? So like what you don't want to do is have, so initially we start off accepting a bunch of propositions, and then you consider the skeptical arguments and you accept the propositions that are constitutive of skepticism. Well, no, that would be missing the point completely, right? The whole point is to get away from the propositional way of doing things, right? It's to get away from language and propositions. So along similar lines, many skeptics might take themselves to be challenging reason as such, or at least that's one way of interpreting them. So this is the kind of approach you find in David Hume. According to Hume, reason in itself is self-defeating. Reason has a tendency to destroy itself. And this is because Hume thinks that skeptical conclusions follow from the rules of reason. So we are able to form beliefs in the first place only due to the intervention of non-rational factors like custom or habit. As Hume once put it, carelessness and inattention alone afford us any remedy. Anybody who proceeds by applying the rules of reason will be unable to believe anything. Indeed, they will find that such rules of reason undermine themselves. Again, from this point of view, it's not a problem that skepticism is self-defeating. That's exactly what the skeptic would expect. I mean, we can put the sort of Humean position in this kind of way, right? Let's say we consider the question, is reason trustworthy? Well, there are two options, right? Either reason is trustworthy or it isn't. Suppose we assume that reason is trustworthy. Well, then we can show that by its own light, reason is untrustworthy because of these skeptical arguments. The skeptical arguments, arise from the rules of reason. So reason has a tendency to defeat itself. And of course, from the point of view of reason, self-defeat is a problem, right? So this is a problem for anybody who forms their beliefs on the basis of reason, or anybody who takes themselves to be forming beliefs on the basis of reason. On the other hand, suppose that reason isn't trustworthy. Well, then it isn't trustworthy. Either way, we can start by assuming that reason is trustworthy or that reason isn't trustworthy. Either way, though, we end up with the conclusion that reason isn't trustworthy. Now, this general argument is itself an application of reason, so it's not surprising that this argument also gets washed away by the skeptical flood. But that again, that's the whole point. The skeptic is attacking reason, so it's not a problem that the tools which use reason are themselves going to be undermined. It misses the point to say that skepticism is self-defeating, because the self-defeat is the point, right? Like, it's supposed to be self-defeating. Well, okay, that's it for today, I think. Those were some thoughts on skepticism and self-defeat, and I will end it there and see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.